Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Maria Freire, President and Executive Director of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, or the FNIH. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation on COVID-19 between Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Freda Lewis-Hall. Before we begin, however, I would like to thank BlackRock for partnering with us to produce and share today's discussion with you. I would like to especially thank Russ Steenberg, Managing Director and Global Head of BlackRock Private Equity Partners, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Foundation for the NIH. It was Russ, in fact, who suggested this fireside chat today, so thank you, Russ. I have the great pleasure and distinct honor of introducing our guests. Dr. Freda Lewis-Hall served as Pfizer's Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President until the end of 2018, and she was Chief Patient Officer and Executive Vice President in 2019. In these roles, Freda expanded outreach to patients, reshaped the focus of their engagement and inclusion, provided health information and education, and amplified the voice of the patient within the company. Dr. Lewis-Hall is also a member of the Board of Directors of the FNIH. Dr. Francis Collins is the Director of the National Institutes of Health, the nation's premier medical research agency. As you may know, Francis has spearheaded the Human Genome Project, and he's very well known for his landmark discoveries of disease genes. The NIH is the largest supporter of biomedical research of its kind in the world. With a budget of more than $41 billion in 2020, the NIH supports biomedical research that spans the spectrum from basic science to clinical research. Today, Freda and Francis will discuss a public-private partnership called ACTIV, or Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines. Launched by NIH and coordinated by the FNIH, ACTIV is working to identify the most promising COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutic treatments. Welcome, Dr. Lewis-Hall and Dr. Collins. Freda?
Thank you so much for having us. And Dr. Collins, you know, I'm excited to have a conversation with you, even if only virtually. And even more delighted to share it with our listeners today. I want to start by asking an overall question. So with COVID-19 facing us, organizations and institutions around the world have launched institutions, everybody in this fight together. What do you see as the NIH's role in responding to this global pandemic?
Well, Freda, it's great to be able to have a conversation with you. We've known each other for quite some time, have gotten involved in all kinds of enterprises to try to advance the cause of medical research. And I would say most of them have gone pretty well. So it's nice to be able to reflect a bit on where we might take that in the context of this unprecedented global pandemic called COVID-19. And thanks to Maria Freire for introducing us and for all the work she does as the head of the Foundation for NIH, which it turns out is a pretty important partner in what we're going to talk about. Well, NIH is, after all, the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, everything from very basic science efforts to clinical trials. So it would be very strange indeed if we were not jumping forward to grab whatever leadership role we think we can contribute in this unprecedented circumstance. And we have certainly been in that space pretty much right from the beginning, when it became clear in late December, early January, that there was something happening that might be more than just a local problem. And when the Chinese government published the sequence, or the Chinese scientists published the sequence of the genome of this virus, we now call SARS-CoV-2, it was the very next day that our vaccine research center began designing a vaccine, the vaccine which is now likely to be the first one in a large-scale phase 3 trial as soon as a couple of weeks from now. So all of this has been happening at a prodigiously rapid pace in an unprecedented way, and it needed to, considering where we are as we're having this conversation now. Over 120,000 people have lost their lives to this in the United States, and many more in other parts of the globe. So if there was ever a time for all hands on deck, that is what this is. I'm speaking to you from my home office. I have not been in my usual workspace for the last 13 weeks because we've all been adhering to recommendations about physical distancing. But I don't think I've ever worked harder. This has been 100, 110-hour weeks for the last 13, just trying to be sure we're marshaling all of those resources, encouraging people to do things in more creative and rapid fashion than they ever have before, and developing the kind of partnerships that make it possible for everybody to contribute and not sort of trip over each other by unnecessary complications and duplication. So it's a wild ride, but it needs to go fast.
Well, when all hands are on deck, it's important to have a leader on deck, such as yourself and the scientists at the NIH to help coordinate and collaborate us so that we can really deliver on our efforts. So let's talk a little bit about ACTIV, which is one of the very important collaborations or partnerships. In fact, I think that in your JAMA Viewpoint article, you called it an unprecedented partnership for unprecedented times. Talk to us a little bit about how this collaboration came into being and what are the areas of focus for ACTIV?
Well, when we looked around in February and March about what was happening as far as activating all the research efforts that you wanted to see in terms of looking for a treatment that would work against this virus, and then developing these vaccine potentially platforms as quickly as possible, there was a lot going on, but it wasn't as well connected or coordinated as it might be. There were hundreds of ideas about drugs that might possibly provide benefit. How are you going to decide which of those ought to be at the top of the list to actually run a rigorous trial? And the vaccines, were they all going to happen in totally different ways with different protocol designs? And would you really be able to sort out at the end how to compare them? So beginning in March, I began talking with colleagues across all of NIH and reaching out to my partners in industry. And I got to say, this was built upon the fact that we had been successful in forming public-private partnerships over the last 6 years or so for Alzheimer's disease, for diabetes, for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, for Parkinson's disease, for cancer immunotherapy. These are all partnerships that over the course of these 6 years have done a lot to advance those fields by bringing together the best and brightest of both sectors and helping them figure out how they can learn from each other and work together in a pre-competitive kind of way. Those projects, which go under the name of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, AMP, kind of built this new tradition of identifying ways that the people in the public and the private sector really can work together and do so in a fashion that advances the field and makes all the data available as soon as it's been derived. So because of AMP, which was a very much a creation of NIH and the foundation for NIH, who served as the program managers of all those AMP projects, and industry, we all kind of knew each other. And so it was not difficult for me to call up heads of R&D of pharmaceutical companies, people like Michael Dolston at Pfizer or Paul Stoffels at J&J, or on down that list, and say, are we really doing everything the best way we could right now for this public health crisis? And pretty soon everybody said, we got to get together and talk about this. On April 3rd, we had a very intense meeting of all of the heads of R&D of about 9 pharmaceutical companies, the heads of NIH, including Tony Fauci and myself and some other involved institutes, FDA, very critically involved in this, the CDC, BARDA, which has a lot of the resources for this kind of public health crisis, the Veterans Administration, the Department of Defense, and again, with the Foundation for NIH serving as the catalyst for all of this. And in that initial meeting, it became very clear that there was an urgent need to pull together a partnership, which we then named ACTIV, because that was what it was going to try to do, accelerate COVID-19 therapeutic interventions and vaccines. And we figured out fairly quickly there were at least 4 areas that needed intense attention. The preclinical area, trying to see whether drugs that could be repurposed that would turn out to be beneficial for COVID-19. The clinical area, how do we actually prioritize those hundreds of candidates and decide which ones ought to go into the trials? Then how do we organize the clinical trial capacity? We have all these trial networks that have been used for lots of applications. We want to bring them together in an unprecedented way so that you could, on a dime, start clinical trials, rapidly enroll participants, and get answers. And then the vaccine effort, the fourth area. So those came together. That's what's described in that article in JAMA about what we're doing. And I think it was pretty astounding. We had that conversation on April 3rd. On April 17th, we announced it. So that was 2 weeks to organize a public-private partnership. By that point, involved 18 companies and all of these other government partners. And basically that, for previous circumstances, is the kind of thing that might have taken a year or two. And we did it in 2 weeks. And I got to say, my hat is totally off to all the partners who decided not to worry too much about whether we had a legal framework or whether somebody might get the credit and somebody else might not get the credit. It was like, no, this is too important. We have to do this together. We have to do it now. And the Foundation for NIH stepped forward to say they could supply all of the support and all the thinking that would be necessary to make those dreams happen. And the staff there, particularly David Woolley, it's just been amazing in the way in which these 4 working groups involving more than 100 people hit the ground running. I mean, they are 24/7, these folks. They are meeting almost constantly. They're setting goals for themselves. They have timelines, when you look at them, that you sort of think, oh, that's the kind of Gantt chart I've seen. Except in this case, it's measured in days instead of in months. And they're living up to it. They're hitting those milestones. So we have come a long way that we would not have been able to do without ACTIV. I'm enormously proud of all the folks that have decided to make this their priority and put aside a whole lot of other things. And we are much further along here than we would have been without that framework to create this sort of design structure that could figure out how to do the trials that we most need to get going. And they are now getting going.
Well, this is amazing progress under circumstances that need it the most, and it's really exciting. And I want to echo all the thanks that have gone out to collaborators, coordinators, volunteers of all ilk who are really throwing themselves into these efforts.
Yes.
We've heard a lot about another effort, which is Operation Warp Speed. Now, is ACTIV a part of Warp Speed? Is it coordinating in some way? How do these two initiatives work together?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people are trying to figure this out because these both came along rather quickly and obviously in a fashion that is moving at they say, as warp speed. So what is Operation Warp Speed? Announced in the Rose Garden at the White House at the end of May. This is a purely governmental effort to bring together all of the government's agencies and resources to be sure that they're totally coordinated and integrated. That means that this needed a kind of a functional glue to bring together what's happening within the Department of Health and Human Services, but also in the Department of Defense. So this also allowed the recruitment of a leader who could oversee all of that. And Moncef Slaoui, who was previously head of R&D and head of vaccine development at GlaxoSmithKline, was brought on board to do that. That allows then a focus on where we're going with vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics that is sort of coherent and pulls all this together. But Warp Speed is purely governmental, whereas ACTIV is a government industry public-private partnership. I think the two are working really well. You can sort of think of ACTIV in many ways as sort of the brainstorming design engine for what needs to happen, coming up with master protocols for monoclonal antibody trials or figuring out what should be the agreed upon endpoints for the vaccine trials so we know exactly what happened with each one of those. Whereas Warp Speed is more concerned about how do we find the funds to be sure we run those trials quickly. How do we make sure we're thinking about the downstream steps if these things work in terms of supply chain and manufacturing and distribution? So I think it's actually turned out to be a pretty functional interaction, and partly because a lot of people are involved in both of these, as I am, to make sure that those links are successful. And then there's one other entity, which is the White House Task Force, which also has a big vision here about how we're going to get through this. And again, though, that is helped by the fact that many of the people involved in one of these are involved in the others. I'm on the task force. I'm part of Warp Speed. I'm the co-chair of the ACTIV Executive Committee with Paul Stoffels. We're not going to let these things get out of sync with each other, even though it sounds a little complicated.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is really around prioritization and coordination in developing a therapeutic. Could you talk to us a little bit more about how you plan to take all of these therapeutic options, therapeutic needs, and then prioritize the ones that have the greatest likelihood as potential treatments?
Right. And it is a challenging effort to try to look at all the options that are out there and make sure we're choosing wisely about which ones to put forward first. I think, as I said earlier, when we started ACTIV and just looked at an inventory, and various groups had produced such inventories of therapeutic ideas, there were more than 400 of them. You can't run clinical trials on 400 different therapeutic ideas anytime soon. So we had to figure out what were the most promising ones. And that meant convening experts, going through example by example, saying, what's the evidence for this scientifically? What's the likelihood that this might actually be something that could be distributed if it worked? Are you going to be able to manufacture many doses of it? Is somebody else studying that particular therapeutic? So we should let them do so. We've been working with the United Kingdom, for instance, very closely to be sure that we're not stepping on each other's toes or wasting things by duplication. Now, ultimately, they got the 400 down to about 37. And then they really went at it hard and came through that with a much shorter list of about a half dozen. That included some immunomodulators, which we thought might be helpful for people with the most severe form of COVID-19, where you're in the ICU and you have this intense overreaction of the immune system, which is causing more trouble than it's helping. And by downsizing that immune response with a modulator, you may be able to save people's lives, as has recently been shown with dexamethasone. It also included idea about anticoagulants, because the New York experience showed that people with severe COVID-19 had this difficulty with hypercoagulability of the blood, and they were getting clots in various places, not just the lungs, but other places also, both arterial and venous. And that called out for a controlled trial to see if anticoagulation, either a full dose or partial dose, might actually be life-saving. All of those things came together. And then there were the ideas about passive immunization with convalescent plasma, big opportunity there, with maybe hyperimmune globulin, where you pool the antibodies from lots of people who have survived COVID-19, make that into a product. Or, and maybe most advanced there, the monoclonal antibodies, which you derive from a survivor, and which are pure antibodies that attack this virus in a place that you can very precisely characterize. All of those have played significant roles in the therapeutic planning. And then you got to do the matchmaking. Okay, so you want to try these immunomodulators, and you want to try them on patients who are in the hospital and pretty sick. How do you find the right clinical network to set that up? And that's another thing ACTIV has been doing. And you have to do it in a place where there are going to be cases. And as the disease has been evolving over the course of time, you probably don't want to run your trial in a place where there aren't very many people getting sick. You want to find the places where the virus is still spreading. I think we're going to be doing a lot of trials in the Southeast pretty soon, because that's unfortunately where a lot of the trouble is.
Now, given that you had mentioned earlier also scientific rigor and the importance there, given the high stakes, the speed that's required, the evolving dynamics, the news coverage, all of the things that are really playing into this pandemic, how do we ensure that the highest scientific rigor is employed as we advance towards safe and effective treatment?
Oh, Freda, I'm really glad you're asking about this, because I think people are concerned when they hear that this is going at an unprecedented speed. Are corners being cut? Are we deciding to accept something as just good enough instead of really rigorously getting the data to show that it's safe and that it's effective? I want to be really reassuring about this, having been in the midst of these discussions for almost every day of the last 6 months. There will be no corners cut. In a certain way, the warp speed brand is maybe not helping this part of the conversation. It does carry this sense of, yeah, we're going really fast, but it also may suggest that we're kind of being cowboys here and not worrying too much about the niceties of rigor. Well, that's just not the case. How is it that we're able to go so much faster without that? What's really being done here in order to cut off the many months and sometimes years that it takes to develop a vaccine is to identify those times where you have a long delay and figure out how by planning ahead you can shrink those back. For instance, most of the time when you're doing a trial, you do that phase 1 trial where you try out the vaccine on a small number of volunteers to see, is it safe? Do they have any bad side effects? And do they raise what looks like an immune response, antibodies, that ought to be helpful? And then you wait and you analyze the data. And if it looks like, okay, maybe you're onto something here, then you go to the phase 2 trial, which might be 1,000 or so patients. And you have to design that, and you have to figure out how to set up the trial network, and you have to enroll, and then you have to do the injections, and then you have to watch and see what happens. And then you finish that, and you wait, and you analyze that data, and you decide whether that looks good. And if it's still okay, then you go on to the phase 3 trial, which might be tens of thousands of individuals. So that's a big deal to set that up. Takes a long time to get people enrolled, might take you many months. And then you have to analyze the data. And then only then do you go to the FDA and say, I think we have something here. And then they have their process of evaluating it, which may go back and forth a while, because generally you haven't really involved them until that last minute. And they may not like the way you designed your trial. Eventually, if they finally say, okay, I think you got something, then you want to distribute it. But, oh my gosh, you got to manufacture maybe millions of doses of this vaccine. I mean, maybe you have to build a factory. So many more months go by. That's the usual way. And that's why it usually takes years. What we are doing here is not to shortchange the rigor of the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, but to basically shrink back those long delays in between by planning ahead, even including the manufacturing. So with these vaccines for COVID-19, the government, those taxpayers' dollars are being invested in actually scaling up manufacturing for vaccines in hopes that they will work, recognizing that they'll have to throw a lot of those out if that's a vaccine that didn't work. And I should have said sooner, it's a good thing here also that we're not just banking on one design of a vaccine. There are at least 4 that are going to be coming along fairly quickly with large-scale trials this summer. And they're different in terms of what their science is. And that's just what you'd want to see, because anybody who's been involved in vaccine development will know that things don't always go the way your textbook said they were supposed to. And we might, with these 4 or 5 vaccines, end up with only 1 or 2 of them working. It's okay if that's the answer, as long as it's not 0. And we're, I think, well enough diversified in terms of the science. We have shots on goal, as they like to say, that I think we're in a good place to say by the end of 2020, we should have something that works, maybe several things that work, but it will not have been done at the expense of any shortcuts with regard to safety. All of these vaccines, before they would be considered okay, are going to need to be tested out in something like 30,000 individuals who will be carefully watched to see if they had any safety problems, any side effects, and carefully watched to see if the vaccine actually prevented them from getting sick, which means all these trials will need to be run in places where the virus is still spreading. That's a big challenge. You talk about doing all of that in the space of the next few months, and you can imagine why it really does have to be all hands on deck, and it is.
But it's a very exciting, I think, proposition that necessity has created a platform for. I can't resist asking you if you think that any of the learnings from this are likely to inform us, inspire us, and change us to do things differently in a post-COVID world.
Freda, I sure hope so. You and I have been in these conversations. Every time we have an outbreak of some sort, we get pretty revved up. I mean, you don't have to look back too far. H1N1, and then Ebola, and then Zika. And now we have this COVID-19. And every one of those previous ones, there's been a big conversation about, okay, this says we really need to be prepared because we know there are going to be future outbreaks and we need to have our systems in place. And they are better in place than they were 20 years ago, but they're still not as ideally positioned as they might be. I hope this time, because it has been such a wake-up call for the whole world, that we will learn from this about what works, what doesn't work, how to be prepared, how to be in a position to do things with great efficiency and safety. There's a lot we can learn here. We just need not to have short memories when we get through this. And we are going to get through this. I mean, a year from now, I think most of us are reasonably optimistic. We will have wide distribution of at least one and maybe more than one effective vaccine, and it will be safe, once again, to be out there in public spaces without being quite so anxious about what the consequences will be. At least that's what I believe will be possible. But we've still got to get through many more months to get there. And then we got to remember what we learned along the way and apply it going forward. Because, okay, this is COVID-19. Are we going to be ready for COVID-24 or whatever it is that's lurking out there? There will be something.
My husband always says people don't change when they see the light. They change when they feel the heat. So maybe this is the heat that will change us.
I think there's a lot of heat here.
Oh, yeah. So the other question that I wanted to ask you is also maybe around post-COVID. You mentioned we have worked many years. I'd like to think actually my hair was brown when we started. And there's been many projects. Yes. So many of projects that we've shared together, and many of them public-private partnerships. And you talked about the value of public-private partnership, the role of an organization like the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, et cetera. What do you think about the future? Will we have a chance to amp up, if you would, no pun intended, our deployment of public-private partnerships? What does that look like for you?
I think the track record over the last 5 or 6 years, and now very acutely in front of many people with the ACTIV partnership, is such that if there were doubters, they've pretty much been won over by what's been accomplished. If you look at those projects under the umbrella of AMP, the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, we did a survey not long ago of all the companies that were involved and the academics involved to say, how did this change the way you approached Alzheimer's or diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis? And it was very gratifying indeed to see really significant decisions had been made about the next generation of therapeutics for those conditions based upon the data that was generated by AMP. And yet that data is available to everybody. So it's probably had a much broader impact than we could assess in that survey just of the participants in the partnership. I think it takes a real mindset to do this well. And I think we have learned this along the way. And if you're going to set up such a partnership, first of all, it's got to be something that everybody sees has real value. It's something that neither sector could do on their own. And it needs to be something that can be made immediately accessible to everybody. Otherwise, NIH would not be in a good position to support it. This has got to be open data access. And it has to be driven by milestones that you can measure. So it's not just, okay, let's have some fun in the lab. These partnerships are very goal-oriented, very milestone-driven, and has to be managed in a way, which the Foundation for NIH has done brilliantly, of making sure those milestones are met and that everybody's held accountable to see that it happens that way. And then you really have to figure out who's deciding what those milestones should be. They've got to make sense. And then everybody has to have skin in the game. You can't just sort of have kibitzers who are weighing in and making suggestions, but really haven't invested. This has to be something where everybody has decided this matters enough that we're going to put our human capital and our financial capital into this, and we're going to make sure it works. It has really helped, I think, with AMP and has now helped a lot with ACTIV to be sure that you have the top leadership in the organizations deeply and intimately involved. This is not getting delegated to sort of 4 levels down. this has got to be something that is seen as a priority by the management of the organization. So with ACTIV, for instance, with Paul Stoffels and myself as the chairs of the executive committee, the other executive committee members otherwise are heads of R&D of pharma, or people like Janet Woodcock, who's running the therapeutics part of Operation Warp Speed, or Gary Disbrow, who runs BARDA. These are clearly indicators that this is something that is considered to be the highest priority, and people notice that and they stick to it, even when things get a little rough, which they always do in these circumstances. But, Freda, I think what it's doing is it's taking this amazing ecosystem, which has been such a powerful source of advancing medicine, particularly in the United States, where we have government support of basic science, taking those discoveries forward, doing some translation, de-risking things to the point where it looks like they might actually turn out to be viable, and then doing this wonderful handoff to the private sector, who runs with those things, brings them forward, tests them out, and ultimately produces the products that the public needs. And that's been a great ecosystem, but it's even better when you have at that point of interface the opportunity to design exactly the kind of science that needs to happen to facilitate progress. And that's what these partnerships have been able to do. I think somebody will write a dissertation about the ACTIV public-private partnership. And I think they'll say pretty nice things about what it accomplished at a remarkable time where it was really needed.
Well, I'm going to look forward to that. I also want to ask one thing. We talked about, I'm thrilled, and I just have to say, I looked at the executive committee and you and Dr. Stoffels as the co-chairs, but it is really a powerhouse of knowledge, information, and experience sitting there helping to respond to this incredibly challenging issue. Not just for us in this room or us on the line, but for the world. And that's quite incredible. The ACTIV work, we talked about the preclinical, we talked about the clinical trial programs, about the vaccines and the therapeutics. Is there any involvement in diagnostics?
I am glad you asked. There is, and it's not part of ACTIV. It's a separate program called RADx. Everything has to have an acronym, and so this is no exception. So that stands for Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics. I guess right now, if you see an NIH acronym and there's an A in it, it's going to be accelerating, because we're all about that. Put the foot down. So RADx aims to try to accelerate the process of getting testing out there for all those communities where you really want to have more and more access, so that you have more and more opportunities to find out who has gotten infected with this virus as quickly as possible, so that they can be separated out, quarantined, and not infect other people. And we all recognize how critical testing is as we are going forward now over the next several months, and particularly worrying about the fall and the possibilities of an even greater risk of this coming back in a second wave. And the testing has come a long way in this country. Some 29 million tests have now been done in the United States. Most of them, though, are tests that are done in big box laboratories, where you have to basically get the sample with a nasal swab and then transport it to that lab through the mail or maybe through a courier, which means there's a delay. You're not going to get the answer right away. You might get it the next day or 2 days later. And meanwhile, somebody who tested positive doesn't know they're positive, and they may still be infecting other people. So one of the goals of RADx is to speed up the development and deployment of testing apparatus that can be done as what we call point of care, where you get the answer almost immediately because the apparatus is right there. And you are able, therefore, to give people information that's much more actionable. We're running a Shark Tank, as we've been calling it, which basically invites all of those technology gurus out there who are coming up with really good ideas about how to detect the presence of this virus, and bring their ideas forward and then get them tried out by a bunch of sharks who are business experts, technology experts, engineers, supply chain people, manufacturing people. And we are already seeing in that group, there are some very exciting potential promising technologies that even as soon as early fall might be possible to get out there in the places where they're needed. We're also deeply concerned about the fact that COVID-19 has hit certain communities with particularly awful vengeance. And I'm talking especially about those communities that have people who aren't really having the luxury, as I am, to stay at home and out of circulation, and may not be in a circumstance where they can avoid lots of other exposure to other people. So communities in urban settings and some in rural settings where COVID-19 has taken a heavy toll, particularly African Americans and Hispanics. And yet that's often the place where the testing is not so easily accessible either. So a part of RADx is called RADx UP, as in underserved populations, to try to speed up the ability to deliver this kind of testing capacity in those communities where it could perhaps do the most good and where it's most needed. There's other pieces to this as well, but overall, this is an effort to try to pull out all the stops. And in this case, our partners are the companies that are really good at diagnostic testing, with whom we're working in every possible way to try to speed up their ability to deliver these kinds of highly technical, highly accurate, very high sensitivity and specificity tests for the presence of the virus. So we'll have that as soon as we can get it, because we're going to need it. Before that vaccine comes along, we're still going to have to depend on public health measures, and those begin with testing so that you know who's got this thing.
Well, that is also very exciting news. Now, we've had a chance to talk about what kind of others are doing, what's happening with ACTIV, what's happening with RADx, public-private partnerships. But I want to ask you the question. We've said that this is all hands on deck, and there's a role for everyone. What do you think are some of the opportunities for people who are listening to us right now to do their part?
Well, that's a great question, and thanks for asking. And I hope, in some small way, our little conversation here might be a motivator for people who are out there. First of all, I would say we are still in a circumstance where the best hope for limiting the suffering and death from this disease is that all Americans and all people across the world decide this is partly their responsibility too, to limit the spread. And as tired as everybody is of the idea of physical distancing, and as tired as people are about hearing about the messages about wearing your mask, we cannot let up on this. The virus does not care that we're tired. It is still out there. So everybody, please, at this point, would be a terrible mistake to just say, oh, we're past this. Most communities, the virus is still out there. Some communities, it's actually spreading quite easily, particularly in the Southeast. So we should all be thinking about that, wearing that mask as you go out in public, keeping that 6-foot physical distance, washing your hands as frequently as you can. And if you develop any kind of symptoms that seem like it might be a cough or a fever, getting a test to find out whether that might be COVID-19 so that you can quickly quarantine yourself and not spread it around. That's up to all of us. And in our country, in the United States, this is not really done in a top-down fashion because that's just not the way our democracy works. It's really got to be bottom-up. And it means it's sort of calling on all of us to take care of not just ourselves, but our neighbors. When you put that mask on, you're not really protecting yourself all that much. You're protecting other people from you if you might be one of those people who's infected and doesn't know it. And there's a lot of that, it turns out, with this virus, which is one of the reasons it's been so hard to control. So that's one thing everybody can do. Don't give up. Don't get tired. Don't decide this is just a political thing, because it's not. Do your own part. Secondly, if you're in a circumstance where you get approached or hear about a clinical trial, then by all means, sign up. We are going to need to enroll maybe 120,000 people in the next 4 or 5 months for these vaccine trials, because each vaccine trial probably needs about 30,000, and there's several different vaccines coming. If you're living in a place where the virus is currently actively spreading, you may hear that they're looking for volunteers to sign up and see whether this vaccine could protect you. And that means doing a lot of signing up in a short period of time. So watch for that. Similarly, if you or someone you know actually gets ill with COVID-19, we're also going to be looking for lots of volunteers to take part in trials of therapeutics that will limit the severity of the illness. So watch for that too. And then thirdly, I think it is up to all of us to try to be sure that science is the way in which we evaluate the facts about what's happening right now. And science is the best way to be absolutely sure we know what we know and also to explore what we don't know. So all of us need, I think, not to fall into the trap of picking up on some idea that just got passed around in social media, which might turn out to be utterly non-scientific, even though it might have caught some interest and begun to go viral in another way. That's the kind of virus we don't need either. So pay attention to the science. Be sure you're well informed about the facts. There's lots of places you can get those facts from CDC, from NIH, from other credible websites. Get yourself informed. Be prepared to use that information when you have a chance to educate other people around you, your family, your neighbors, and also to counter the crazy stuff that sometimes comes around before it gets going too far, because we all have a role here, I think, in terms of being purveyors of scientific truth. We need that more than ever. So everybody can get involved. I'm glad you asked the question, Freda. All hands on deck, that really means all hands on deck.
Well, thank you. We are grateful for your hand on deck and for you spending time with us today. Informative, inspiring, and all of that. So let me say thank you again, and I'll turn it over to Maria.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Freda. This has been just a riveting and inspiring conversation. And thank you again, BlackRock, for your partnership. To those of you who are listening, we hope that you found this conversation insightful. And if you want to learn a little bit more about ACTIV or about enrolling in a clinical trial, as was just mentioned, please visit nih.gov. To learn more about the Foundation for NIH, you can find us at FNIH.org. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful, wonderful day.